When we make our Hajj, we're running between Safa and Marwa because of an African woman.
The figures you've mentioned, you could make like an epic movie series with what some of the events in their life, occurred.
So Africa is involved right in this, directly in the discussion from the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam. People have a tendency, to have this cognitive dissonance, to not understand how central Africa is to the message itself.
We become the greatest barrier to accessing that treasure, our ignorance.
And that's so important for Muslims today to gain a new perspective.
No, I'm not worried at all. I rely on God, Allah.
On behalf of the Lifehawk team, thank you for watching this video. And for more clips and beneficial content, please subscribe to the Lifehawk channel, your #1 source for personal Islamic development.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back, everyone, to our next session with an amazing speaker, sheikh, community leader, activist, Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick. We will be speaking about the lost treasure, the legacy of Islamic revivers in Africa. And hopefully we can actually get a lot of lessons for us to be able to use in our current situation here in North America, because there's a wealth of experience and knowledge that comes for us from the African continent. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khair for joining us, Sheikh. You had a very positive contribution, was received very well yesterday. A lot of excellent feedback in your contribution with the panel discussion. And now we get to focus with you. You had a lecture that was similar during United Islam Awareness Week. And myself, I learned a lot. And I feel that a lot of people are unaware of the great revivers and contributions to the deen that we have from many of the giants from the African continent. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that we're not connected, or we're not aware of so many of the lessons that we could be learning from them?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ba'd. The important issue in the beginning, and you'll see me referring back to it again, is perspective. It's how we look at things. And, when we talk about Africa itself, there's a tendency to look at Africa as something distant and far away. In the same way that with white supremacy, Africa is a dark, foreboding continent. Even amongst Muslims, to a certain extent, Africa was seen as a backward place, and basically a place where slaves came into Mecca and Medina and the Muslim world. But it didn't really have too much to offer in terms of knowledge, leadership, and guidance. That is the opposite of the reality. It's almost like for years people were saying Christopher Columbus discovered America. And, when the reality was put to people, you can't discover a place when people are living there already. There's 75 million people living there. There's great civilizations. It was really a trauma for some people, especially some European people, Americans especially, to say he didn't discover America, because, it's like they call it cognitive dissonance. It's like part of the brain just doesn't work. So they just blotted out the native populations. So similarly, in dealing with Africa itself, people have a tendency, to have this cognitive dissonance, to not understand how central Africa is to the message itself. And so that means we need a little perspective. You got to, picture in your mind Arabia and Africa and the Red Sea. The Red Sea is not the Pacific Ocean.
Yes.
It's not a huge barrier in between Arabia and Africa. As a matter of fact, we never called it Arabia like Asia, and the other side, Sudan or Ethiopia, is Africa. Like it's two separate continents. They were areas where people lived, linguistic groups and tribal groups, but they were not separate continents with separate worlds. As a matter of fact, they were intricately tied together from ancient times. And so if we accept the fact that Egypt is part of Africa, and if you look at the map, although people have in their minds Egypt is the Middle East, but if you look at the map, Egypt is Africa. And if you go back, especially before Christ, before Isa alayhi salam, you will see that there were very few non-Africans on the continent. So the reality is that all the discussions that are dealing with, for instance, Ibrahim alayhi salam, you could even go back further to Adam, right? But I won't go there yet. Go to Ibrahim alayhi salam, and he leaves Iraq and travels through Syria and down into Egypt, Africa. So he's in Africa. His wife, who was given to him as a servant, Hajar or Hagar, she's an African. And the son, Ismail alayhi salam, has an African mother and an Iraqi father. So Africa is involved right in this, directly in the discussion from the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam. When we make our Hajj, we're running between Safa and Marwa because of an African woman who was running in between Safa and Marwa. And you can continue on when you look at Musa alayhi salam, or even go to Yusuf alayhi salam. Yusuf was taken into Misr, into Egypt. That's Africa. That's the reality. You go back a little bit to Luqman, the great wise man. A chapter in the Quran is there. He's an African. He's a Nubian. And if you go in the text, it's there. But cognitive dissonance in some people's mind would make Luqman look like something else. If you ask the average Muslim, what did Luqman look like? He'd probably say, if they were from India and Pakistan, probably look sort of Asian. If they were an Arab, he would look sort of Arab. But very few would actually say he was a black Nubian. So it's something that has been sort of not totally erased, but sort of covered up within our understanding and our perspective. And that's so important for Muslims today to gain a new perspective, because we have information. The continents and the languages are not a barrier like they used to be. So we can actually cross the barriers and gain a new consciousness in terms of when we're dealing with the African continent. Okay, so that perspective part is really important right from the beginning.
Jazakallah khair. I think that gives us a good insight, because for a lot of people, they don't appreciate and understand that many of these figures that we look up to and role models are from African descent, and it's a treasure. And oftentimes we become the greatest barrier to accessing that treasure. Our ignorance becomes such a big barrier to do that. And the first step, I think, many of our previous speakers, and you've also alluded to it, the first step to overcoming ignorance or many of our problems we face is to educate ourselves. What do you feel are some of the common challenges that we are facing here in North America, and maybe perhaps some of the challenges that are in parallel that were faced by some of those who tried to revive the deen in the African continent? Because in your lecture, you alluded to some of those revivers, those people who brought Islam back, or the true essence of Islam back into their communities after maybe it was corrupted for a period of time. So what commonalities do you see with our society and those societies in the past that needed reviving?
As far as the challenges are concerned, I mean, in terms of perspective and our understanding, we are living in the shadow of white supremacy and Eurocentrism. And that is the whole civilizational concept, of Europe being the source of civilization, of white being positive, of North being developed and South being underdeveloped. We're living in the shadow of this. And white supremacy affects almost everything that we do in education, even as far as subjects like mathematics. And you would say that, what does white supremacy have to do with math? Because math is just numbers, right? But if you ask people, where did math come from? Where did geometry come from? They would probably say the Greeks.
Yes.
But that's not true. Because the Greeks didn't lie themselves. When you read their texts, they will tell you that we got our civilization from the Egyptians. And they were dark-skinned people with curly hair. So, but we've blocked that out. So that white supremacy, is one of the challenges that we constantly face here in the Western countries.
It's interesting that you say, I just want to interject here for a moment, because when you said math, subhanAllah, when I was growing up, my father told me, he said, he told me you're going to face racism in this country. He's like, you're going to face racism. This is a fact of life. He told me, he's like, make sure you practice your math, because that's one thing that if you get the right answer, they can't, they have to mark it right. It's not subjective. They can't, so it reminded me of that statement that my father said, is like, hey, you're going to deal with racism, but if you can get the right answer in math, they can't take marks away from you for being a different color.
Go ahead.
Right. And he was right to a certain extent in terms of, being an engineer or building something or making a formula.
Yes.
But what is talking about that history? But what is in back of that is that when you got it right, in the back of your mind or people's mind is, it was white people who started this. So in other words, you have brought back the Greek concepts. You're now thinking like a Greek. And the furthest thing in your mind is that you're actually thinking like an African. That the Great Pyramid of Giza, 2560 BC, it's perfect right angles.
It's a wonderment of engineering, right? And you need mathematics and physics, and you have to be masters in that to build something like that with the technology that they had.
100%.
That's right. And the Greeks recognized that. But when white supremacy came, when Europe back in the 16th century started to take slaves from Africa and they had to justify it, then white supremacy kicks in, racism in terms of the ideology, and the whole of the history starts to get distorted or turned around. And so Muslims then, trying to revive Islam, trying to look at ourselves, we face not only white supremacy, but we face our own tribal, ethnic problems that we bring from the Muslim world itself. And we have Arab versus non-Arab and, different divisions, that have taken place within our consciousness. So really, again, it's important to go back to education, to go back to knowledge. And what I've found in doing research over the years is that many times the truth is hidden in plain sight. In other words, it's something which is looking you in the face, right? Columbus didn't discover America. There's 75 million people living there.
Yes.
It's looking you in the face, and it's just a matter of you or me turning it around and saying, no, Columbus was discovered in 1492 because he was lost. He bumped into America on his way to India. You see, so it's just it's hidden literally in plain sight. And so for Muslims, and I know for some people it really hurts for them, to think that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not look like them, or the Sahaba did not necessarily look like them. It's a natural thing that people have when they revere a figure, to try to shape that person to look like them. Take the case of Buddhism, for instance. From what I understand, Buddha was actually he was like a Pathan. He was from northern, Pakistan. That's why a lot of the ancient Buddhist mounds are in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But when you look at the drawings, the sculptures, the statues of Buddha, He looks like he's Chinese or he's Southeast Asian.
It's like a sumo wrestler.
Right, round face.
Yeah.
Nothing like a Pathan.
Yeah.
You see, so it's the people took the teachings, but the image of themselves, they wanted to put it into the place of Buddha. Similarly, Muslims have done this. They have literally put their own face into the original companions of the Prophet ﷺ, even into the Prophet himself, and put this image in books, in their writings, even sort of like distorted certain terminologies, not even in an evil way, but it's because their perspective was wrong. So it's so important to have proper perspective when we are looking at things and when we are dealing with people.
Okay. So, you touch upon two things that our communities here have been dealing with for years, decades, right? Probably since, we had any type of significant presence in the West, dealing with, white supremacy and asabiya, especially amongst ourselves.
That's right.
Is there an example of revivers in Africa that overcame that?
Yes. Again, when we look at Africa itself, and what I try to do in my talk is not just focus on one area, but then sort of connect the areas. Because when we look at the movement of Islam out of Mecca itself, you have to go back to the first hijrah. You got to go back to that first migration in the 5th year of the prophethood, when the Prophet ﷺ sent his companions to Al-Habasha. He sent them to present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. And that is where they landed. That's Africa. That's what we call Africa today. And it was the great Ashama an-Najashi, the Negus, radiallahu anh, the great emperor of Ethiopia, Christian, eventually accepted Islam, who literally gave life to the Muslims when they were in sanctuary and became one of the great names. And the Prophet ﷺ made Salatul Janazah lil Ghaib. That is the funeral prayer for the absent person. Then when you look at the spread of Islam, when the Romans had attacked from the north and when the Muslims defeated the Byzantines and took back Syria, Jerusalem, and they started to take the Byzantine holdings. Now, they looked at Africa, and their first entrance would have been Egypt. And so it is Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu who's going into Egypt. This is Africa again that they're going into. And the Coptic people, who are the native Egyptian people, they deal with the Muslims as allies because they looked at the Romans as an occupying force. And so that unity was able to defeat the powerful Roman Empire. And then the Muslims went right across North Africa. And as Uqba ibn Nafi' radiallahu anh is riding his horse all the way to the Atlantic, you are going across years, centuries, hundreds and thousands of years of human existence. You're now at the birthplace of humanity. You're now, in the African continent. And so as they go across, they're meeting the Amazigh, that they call the Berbers today. And these are the original inhabitants of the Sahara Desert, who lived in 10,000 years ago. Sahara Desert was a rainforest. And so there's a lot of different people. There's a lot of civilizations. Islam goes across there and then looks south, because in the south there were gold mines. There was a trade route. And so trade started going south, and the message started to go south. It is even said that Uqba ibn Nafi', rahimahullah, was tabi, that he actually not only rode to the Atlantic, he went south. And he landed down in a place would be present-day Mauritania, parts of Mali. He reached down in that area. And some African historians say that he actually married there, and he has offspring. So there are people who, in that region, who claim to be descendants of Uqba ibn Nafi'. The point is, though, when Islam goes across and then starts to go down, the Berber people, the Amazigh, and an African nation, take Islam, and it is revived. There are great people coming out of these nations. Abdullahi ibn Yasin, rahimahullah, who founded the Murrabitoon, that they call Al-Muravids, right? This is a person coming from Morocco. Morocco is Africa. The great Al-Murrabitoon movement. And you find Jibril, you find that, Umar, the great leader, Abu Bakr ibn Umar, was a great leader of the Murrabitoon. He founded their capital, Marrakesh. That's Morocco. That's Africa. And if you look at pictures, they have sort of a drawing, a relief of what they thought was Abu Bakr ibn Umar, the first Amir of the Murrabitoon after Abdullah ibn Yasin. He's actually a black man. He's black for sure. Okay, and then he hears about people in the south, because Abdullah ibn Yasin actually didn't stop in the north. He went south. He went down to the Senegal Valley, the place called the Fouta Toro, on the border of Mauritania and Senegal. And he was in this region. This is where the Murrabitoon started as a movement. They started to develop. And so it is out of that area that Abu Bakr ibn Umar, eventually goes down to that area to give Dawah. And he gives the leadership to Yusuf ibn Tashfeen, rahimahullah. Now, Abu Bakr ibn Umar starts to do Dawah. He goes across. That's going east. So you're now going through what later became the Mali Empire, the Ghana Empire, right across. He was giving Dawah. Hundreds and thousands of people are embracing Islam. These are African people who are spreading Islam amongst African people. Okay? And this is a story, unfortunately, that the majority of Muslims, unless you're from North Africa or West Africa, they don't know about this story. And
their stories are amazing. They're the biographies, the figures you've mentioned, like you could make like an epic movie series with what some of the events in their life occurred.
That's right. I mean, Yusuf ibn Tashfeen, rahimahullah, his life would be, they made this movie El Cid before. It was a movie some years ago when I was growing up. Charlton Heston, one of the actors back in the 60s and 70s. And El Cid was like a blockbuster. And but he is El Sayed. He was a European, who was trained by the Murrabitoon and Muwahidun. He was trained by them, and then it's dealing with his life. Yusuf ibn Tashfeen, his life is unbelievable. He takes over the leadership, and after traveling throughout the desert, he has an army with him. He can put in the field 100,000 horses. He puts in the field. Think about this: 100,000 horses he can bring to the field. That's his cavalry. And he controls North Africa, the desert, down to Senegal, then eventually Andalusia, all of these areas. And the Murrabitoon are so humble that when they read their Jumu'ah khutbah, they give their support to Amir al-Mu'mineen, not to themselves. They call their leader Amir al-Muslimin. And they respected the Abbasid Khalifa in Baghdad. So they were connected to the rest of the Muslim world. Even though the rest of the Muslim world doesn't know about them, they were connected to the Muslim world. So it's that area of the Fouta Toro where the ancient civilization of Takrur, which started embracing Islam around the 9th century, they started embracing Islam. And then it's around the 11th century that their empire develops as an uncompromising, strong empire of Islam. It's out of that area that a number of revivalist movements come. So these are and in West Africa and the desert, you have what they call is scholarly clans. So in other words, there are clans of people, tribes of people who specialize in Islamic scholarship. Amongst the Berbers, they called it Zawaya. A Zawaya. And they are actually the forerunners of the present-day Mauritanians, right? Shanqitis. Because many people realize that many of the Mauritanian scholars are some amazing scholars coming out of that area. Right? So their forerunners is a clan called the Zawaya, right? Then you have amongst the Mandinka people, which is another great nation in West Africa, you have Jakhanke, and you have Jula, and Wangara. These are scholarly clans, and they're involved in business. So they're nomadic people. They move around doing business, and they're scholars at the same time. So they are able to spread Islam. Now, this is a perfect way of spreading Islam because, you know, Islam, as we discussed in our other discussion, you can't force people to embrace a religion. The people who spread Islam were merchants. So what was so unique about the African continent, and especially the desert region in West Africa, was that the merchants, many of the merchant groups, were scholars themselves. So it wasn't like a merchant following a group of, it wasn't like a scholar following a group of merchants. The merchants themselves were scholars. And they're the perfect vessels for carrying Islam. And they went right across West Africa, the Savannah region, right into Nigeria, then down toward the tropical areas, carrying the message of Islam and reviving it. And there's a number of great empires which developed, you know, out of this movement of Islam. The great Mali Empire, right? And people know Mansa Musa now as the richest person who ever lived. Then the great Songhai Empire with Askia Muhammad Touré, and the great empire of Bornu. That would be more toward Lake Chad. And there's a great scholar, Al-Kanemi. Al-Kanemi is a great scholar. So you have a series of scholarly clans and scholarly individuals who are moving Islam around. And when it becomes corrupted, they revive Islam. So this is the tradition that we're looking at, this revivalist tradition that developed in West Africa. And it's really amazing. And it's complex. And you'll find similarity if you go to other parts of the Muslim world. But, you know, maybe because the scholarship of Africa was so preserved, it wasn't so corrupted by a lot of the politics that you might find, say, in Iraq or in Syria or in places like that. And plus, they didn't have the Mongols to fight against, too, when the Mongols came down and destroyed everything. So therefore, you can literally see how the society becomes corrupted and how tajdeed happens, revival of Islam, awakening. You can literally follow the awakening. And I was fortunate to come into the personality of Sheikh Uthman dan Fodio, you know, and to meet some of the great scholars who were researching his writings. He had about 150 books written in Arabic, and to meet members of his family and to actually travel in the areas where he lived to really get a feel of the Hausa land and the Fulani people there. And so this is why it meant so much to me. And I actually developed this as a methodology that I applied myself in the 21st century. And this is one of my secrets, right?
Do I feel that the New York police are providing enough protection, or do I have to have protection of my own? I look for protection from Allah.